Well, we got a minute. I'm gonna buy that truck I've been wanting.
Wait, don't you need like weeks to shop for a car?
I don't. Carvana makes it super convenient to find exactly what I want.
Hold up. You're buying a car on your phone? Isn't that more of a laptop thing?
You can shop wherever you want.
I like to do my research, read reviews, compare models. Plus, Carvana has thousands of options. How'd you decide on that truck?
Because I like it.
Oh, that is a great reason.
Go to Carvana.com to sell your car the convenient way.
Selling a little or a lot? Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your own online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage? Shopify's there to help you grow. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout. 36% better on average compared to the other leading commerce platforms. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Get a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/promo. Shopify.com/promo.
Have you ever wondered if there are behaviors, personalities, and ways of being that correlate with success besides things like IQ and hard work? Have you noticed that people who do well in life seem to all be very different people in so many ways that it's hard to define specifically why some people do so well? Yet at the same time, you can kind of tell when someone has it, they have a vibe of success, and when someone doesn't have it. Well, there is a lot to dig into here, from our relationship with fear to how open we are to new ideas, and whether we think of others as individuals or as tools. And in case you're wondering, it's better to think of them as individuals. Well, it's been a while since we've had an interview, and I'm excited about today's show because joining me today to explain his decades of research into the psychology of leaders and success is author Ryan Gottfredson. He has a brilliant book called Success Mindsets that covers the 4 most important and real mindsets based on leading psychology that contribute to success in life, work, and leadership. And I do want to point out that it's not based on just some ideas he thinks are good from coaching people, but actually peer-reviewed science and data, though he does, of course, coach people. And he has some incredibly interesting stories to back it all up, and he also has fantastic energy, I might add, and a lot of enthusiasm to go with it. So a lot of fun in this conversation, and he definitely gave me vibes of someone with success at what he does. We discuss the human innate bias to assume that we have the right mindsets in life and how to uncover the true reality under our sneaky veil of illusions. We also uncover why a growth mindset still isn't enough to fix the other mindsets in our life that are deficient, and how to build a more solid and robust approach to becoming a doer. There's a lot of actionable takeaways in this episode coming up, so stay tuned. Okay, just as a word of warning before we get into it, if you find yourself wondering if Sam sounds weird and a bit different in the interview today, well, that's because this is a recording from one of the older interviews in the archives, and it felt like a very relevant thing to be bringing back up. But at the time, I was not perhaps as good at speaking, but luckily Ryan does most of the talking. We dive into the episode with me asking Ryan why the mindsets that he has researched and that we discuss in the episode are so important in the topic of behavior change.
One of the things that I found through all this research is that the majority of focus on leadership and largely personal improvement is around behaviors. How can we improve what we do? But what I've realized as I've worked with leaders is leadership is not about what you do, it's who you are that really makes you effective. And so as I dove into this understanding that leadership is about being a certain type of person, then I started to focus on how do we capture that being. And over the last 7 years, I've really been focusing on that element, which has led me right into mindsets. Is our mindsets are largely the mental lenses that fuel almost all of our processing on a day-to-day basis. And if we can understand that, and if we can improve the mindsets of leaders, then we can improve how effective they are.
Okay, cool. And so you decided that would link straight into coaching and like writing books and things, and that's the best way to change people?
what I've learned is through all of the research that's been done on mindsets is one of the things that's really fascinating is rather small interventions can dramatically shape and improve people's mindsets. So there's dozens of studies that are out there that talk about writing 2 paragraphs or watching a 3-minute video or going through a 15-minute training can have some pretty significant effects on how people think, learn, and behave weeks and sometimes even months down the road. And so what I primarily do in terms of the consulting and coaching that I do is I help leaders awaken to the mindsets that they have. So I help them identify what are their current mindsets and what mindsets do they need to have in order to become better leaders. And so through this awakening process that covers about half the ground that we need to just awaken, first of all. And then once we awaken, then we can engage in activities that improve the specific mindsets that they need to work on.
Okay, cool. Because it's really changing the psychology of how people approach everything that comes in them and like how they feel. I guess what I'd like to know is how do you then coach people to like really change what they're thinking?
I want to answer the small things that you could do, but do you care if I just give a little bit of context?
Yes, please. Yeah, that should have been the first question. So
No, you're good. No, but I think it's important to get there, but it's important to know why we get there. So what research has found is that largely 90% of our thinking, acting, feeling, and judging is done essentially on autopilot. It's done through our non-conscious automatic processes. And we all know that autopilot only seems to work if the instruments work appropriately. And here's the interesting thing. So I've got a mindset assessment, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, but I've had thousands of people take my mindset assessment. And what I've found is that 95% of people do not have the optimal instruments to drive their autopilot, which suggests that most of us are, while we're operating with our non-conscious automatic processes, that's actually not as effective as it should be. But if we could become aware of what our non-conscious automatic processes are and then improve them, then we could, 1, become more conscious, or 2, we can improve our autopilot tendencies. And so I think that there's a lot of power in that. And here's the problem in my mind is, and I'll be interested in your opinion on this, but when I go around and speak, it seems to me that most people have the word mindset in their vocabulary. But then if you were to ask them, what mindsets do you need to be, or what mindsets do you need to have to be effective? Do you feel like you would get any specific answers?
yeah, because if I run the growth mindset podcast, I'm pretty sure everyone would just say growth mindset straight away because
Right.
they've just heard it 5 minutes ago kind of thing if they're talking to me.
Yeah.
A little bit in a bad position to really have good like scientific data coming at me. But if I didn't mention that at all, then yeah, I don't know what people would say. They might just try and say a good mindset or
Positive mindset, right?
Yeah, that kind of thing,
Yeah.
rather than specific qualities about it. Yeah, some can-do attitude and like motivating and that kind of thing. And yeah, that's those are 2 qualities you do need, but there's a lot of other things that you also need to cultivate.
Unfortunately, I think those are good answers, but they're a little vague. And so here's, to me, the huge crux of the problem is that what I'm suggesting is that our mindsets, which control our non-conscious automatic processes, essentially control everything that we do, including our effectiveness and success, yet we don't have a language to talk about. We don't know what mindsets to even focus on. And in your case, where you focus on growth mindset a lot, maybe we know growth mindset, but what else beyond growth mindset? And so that's where I was at a few years ago as I found out all this research by Carol Dweck and others on growth and fixed mindsets. And I thought, what other mindsets are out there that I need to be aware of? And so as I started to dive into the literature, I found that there's pockets of mindset research being done, some in psychology, some in marketing, some in education, some in management. And they're all finding the same things, which is that our mindsets shape our thinking, learning, and behavior, but they were largely not talking to each other. And so what I've now done is I've pulled together these different pockets of mindsets into one framework that allows people to truly awaken to their mindset, because what I'm doing is I'm giving them a language and a vocabulary that allows them to objectify their mindsets. So what I've come up with is there's 4 different sets of mindsets. There's others that are out there, but there's 4 sets of mindsets that have been rigorously studied over the last 30 years. And all 4 of these sets of mindsets range on a continuum from negative to positive. And so if people can identify where they fall along this continuums, that helps them identify, okay, where am I at now? How is that affecting me? And also, where do I need to go in order to improve my processing? And so that's where my mindset assessment kicks in, is that people could take in, I share a link or whatever in your show notes, that people could take this mindset assessment for free, and then they can identify what mindsets they have along each of these continuums. And so at some point in time, whether it's now or later, we could walk through briefly what each 4 of these sets of mindsets are.
That was going to be my next question. Whoa, you've introduced it now. I want to hear about it.
Yeah, so the basic idea is we could structure interventions along each of these sets of mindsets, and we could dive into that. But I think the first step in the process is this awakening to the current mindsets that we have. So the 4 sets of mindsets I usually start with fixed and growth, partly because that's quite familiar. It's also the most heavily researched of the 4 sets of mindsets. And the difference between fixed and growth is when we have a fixed mindset, we see ourselves and others as being unable to change our natural talents and abilities. But when we have a growth mindset, we see ourselves and others as being able to change our natural talents, intelligence, and abilities. And then that, just based upon this lens that we're wearing, that shapes how we interact with the world. So for example, if we come up on a challenge and we have a fixed mindset, which means that we don't believe that we can change, then we're going to see that challenge as something that we might fail at, and we might be rather scared of that challenge, because if we don't believe that we can change and we fail, then we're left to interpret that as though we are a failure. So those with a fixed mindset have a tendency to see challenge and failure as things to avoid, but those with a growth mindset see challenge and failure as opportunities to learn and grow. And based upon just the natural lenses that we're wearing, shapes how we see the situation, which then correspondingly shapes how we think about it, how we learn, and how we behave. And so our mindsets are these things that cause people to see the same exact thing, but interpret them potentially completely differently. And that shapes how effectively they operate. So that's an example of the fixed and growth. Next one is closed and open mindsets. So when we have a closed mindset, we are closed to the ideas and suggestions of others. When we have an open mindset, we're open to the ideas and suggestions of others, and we're willing to take them seriously. I think one of the good ways to describe that is by the story that we tell ourselves about our mind. So we could come into any situation, if we consider our mind to be a bucket, how full do we consider our bucket to be on that particular topic that is being discussed? If we feel like our bucket is already full, like I already know everything, then what happens if drops get put in the bucket? They just fall off the side. But if we go into the situation and we may have a lot in our bucket, but if we're able to see that the bucket is really big, even though we have a lot in there, but it's really big, that leaves room for taking in information. So one of the big differences between those with the closed mindset and those with an open mindset is those with the closed mindset, they primarily are focused on being seen as being right. Thus, they're seeking after information that supports their point of view. But those that have an open mindset, they're not focused on being seen as being, they're focused on finding truth and thinking optimally. Thus, they want to ask questions and even disconfirming questions. And so, again, people can see the same thing, such as somebody disagreeing with you, and somebody with a closed mindset would see that as a threat and get defensive. Whereas somebody else would see that as an opportunity to learn and grow and coming closer to a better understanding of what truth is.
Yeah, so if you can really try and, because everyone has a bit of a natural reaction to want to be right whenever they say something, but if you can harness that reaction when it's like slight annoyance, if you said change that to make it feel like it's excitement when someone's telling you you're doing something wrong, you're like, oh, cool, I could learn something new, and then that's really good. But what I just thought about as you were saying that is closed versus opens, and you're more likely to respond to people's inputs. So Is there any studies relating to introverts versus extroverts on this? Because extroverts want to talk about stuff, whereas introverts are like more like self-contained and happy with their own things. And it just made me think perhaps there's a link as well. Or has there been any studies on that?
Not directly, and not that I'm aware of. And so in the academic literature, I've called it closed and open. In the academic literature, they call it implemental and deliberative mindsets. I call it closed and open because that's much more accessible than implemental and deliberative mindsets.
Yeah.
And so in terms of these implemental and deliberative mindsets, I haven't seen any studies that look at personality and personality's role on these mindsets. I have a tendency to think about mindsets as being different than personality in the sense that personality is a much more stable trait within us. We're not very likely to go from being an introvert to being an extrovert throughout the course of our lives. Whereas our mindsets are a relatively stable trait where we are able to change our mindsets, but then once we change them, they're a little bit longer lasting than, let's just say, our attitudes or our moods, because those could change fairly rapidly. Our mindsets are generally something we carry with us for quite a while. But again, they are something that we can change. So I think, but my hunch is based upon other research on related topics, is it seems like you're probably onto something, that extroverts probably have more of a tendency to being closed-minded than introverts.
The growth mindset is you can get better at anything in some ways. So if you do have a closed mindset, you should recognize that if you have a growth mindset to then force yourself to then get an open mindset kind of thing.
You bring up a really good point that I found was really interesting. So I assumed when I first created my personal mindset assessment that people could take, I assumed that there would be a correlation across all of the positive mindsets in the sense of if you're high on one, you're going to be high on all the others. And that just isn't the case. And I think that's the value of considering more mindsets than just fixed and growth.
Yeah.
As powerful as they are and as important as they are, what I'm finding is people can be very growth-minded, but also be very closed-minded.
Yeah, you could think that good, I'm really good at things, and I'm also really good at getting better at things because I have a growth mindset. But I'm not going to listen to anyone's opinion because I'm so good at like getting good at things by myself. And that's a closed mindset.
So by becoming aware of more than just our fixed and growth mindsets, then that allows us to, if we have a growth mindset and a closed mindset, and we're not aware of the closed mindset component, we're ultimately putting a cap on our success.
Yes, it's, I guess, on the Martin Seligman, I've done a whole podcast on Martin Seligman and his theories, and now I can't even think of the word I'm trying to, learned optimism and learned pessimism. When you've got yourself into, you don't know what you don't know kind of thing, and you have yourself in these ruts, and when you are just thinking you're like full on growth mindset, but you just in the rut of being closed mindset to other things, you just wouldn't even conceive of that as a problem.
Yeah. Let me share a quote with you that I love, and this comes from Shane Parrish with Farnham Street. I don't know if you're not familiar with his blog and podcast, but he asked the question, are you open or closed? And then he says, before you smugly slap an open-minded sticker on your forehead, consider this. Closed-minded people would never consider that they could actually be closed-minded. In fact, their perceived open-mindedness is what's so dangerous.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but I really relate to this. I think, man, 10 years ago, if you would have asked me if I had an open or closed mindset, I would have been completely open. I don't see how I could have even more of an open mindset than what I have. But I look back 10 years ago and I think, oh my goodness, I was so closed-minded. I was so rigid in my thinking. I thought I knew it all. And so I think that this aspect of closed and open is relatively difficult for us to evaluate within ourselves, which is why I think like a personal assessment can be really valuable.
Yeah, it's funny. I had a business partner who he gave me the Ray Dalio book, 12 Principles. And it's like, oh, it's the best book, you got to read this. And he thought he embodied all these principles. And he had the most closed mindset thing ever. And he was like really smart, but he had a ceiling on how smart he could be because he just wouldn't listen to anyone. And you're like, oh, bro.
Yeah.
But yeah, he thought he was full on 100% on every good quality that you could possibly have. But he was so blind to how crap he was at so many things.
Interesting. And I would say, and let me give you another plug for that Ray Dalio book, Principles, is I think that is the best book out there on this idea of closed and open mindsets. It just makes sense when he says it. And it seems, oh, this is so common sense to have an open mindset. But the problem is that, as I mentioned earlier, each of the negative mindsets are tied into fear. And if we don't awaken to the fear that's driving, if we have a closed mindset, then we're going to have some problems. So some of the fears that are associated with a closed mindset is that we fear looking bad in front of others. We fear change. We fear uncertainty. We fear not being in control. So if those are things that we fear, then our natural response is to develop this closed mindset to protect us from experiencing the feelings that are associated with those types of things. And that's the great thing about Ray Dalio is he's essentially broke down there. You shouldn't be afraid of not being in charge because that makes you empowering. You shouldn't be afraid of uncertainty because nothing is certain in the future. You get to create your future. And so that's, I think, one of the cool things about this is that when you start talking to people about their mindsets at this level that we're talking about, it becomes maybe the deepest dive that they've ever done within themselves in terms of introspection. Until people become aware of these labels, they haven't had the tools to be able to dive in as deeply as what they can in terms of their introspection. And so this, when I go out and speak and I present this to groups, usually when we start talking through these different mindsets, the group really clams up because they're going inward at a level that they've never done before. And it's really a cool experience as a presenter to see this because you see them dive in, they clam up, and then you bring them out. And then you say, okay, now what do we do with this great information? And then that's when the magic happens.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking, what I found really helpful is to realize that it's not so much you personally sometimes being wrong, is that actually humans are just wrong and that it's just a human tendency to be completely bonkers the way you appreciate things. And then when you realize that, it's not so bad to look at yourself and be like, oh, cool, I'm completely wrong about so many things.
Yeah.
About when Darwin came up with evolution, everyone was just looked at him like it was completely bonkers and no one wanted to believe it. Or Einstein with theory of relativity. All of the top scientists were like, you're a freaking idiot. When it comes to anything. And that's the example of a closed mindset. And that's all the top people in the community. And that's just humans because they want to be right. And if all the best humans on the planet at a given point in time would do that, there's probably the same thing going on right now in your boardroom or wherever. It's not like something you need to take personally as, oh, it's just me being wrong. It's the human tendency to not really think about things logically. And then you can feel much nicer about going on and battling with these hard feelings that you're coming up against.
For sure. Yeah. These negative mindsets are ultimately fueled by this desire to self-protect. The positive mindsets are fueled by a desire to organization advance. There's a very big difference between operating in self-protection mode versus organization advance mode. And so just if we could be okay and comfortable knowing that nobody's perfect, but that opens the door for us to actually learn, grow, and improve.
Yeah, but as a child, is it not something you get by default in your personality of your approach to like risk and challenges? If you are more likely to enjoy having risk and being wrong about things and being outside of your comfort zone, then you're more likely to have an open mindset.
So what you're doing is you're providing a great segue to our next set of mindsets. That's perfect. So our third of mindsets is the difference between prevention and promotion mindsets. So when we have a prevention mindset, our primary goal is to not lose. But when we have a promotion mindset, our primary goal is winning and gains. And so to help explain these, I'm going to use the analogy that we're a ship captain. So if we're a ship captain and we're out at sea and we have a prevention mindset, and I know that you were just in the North Sea, so maybe you relate to this a little bit, but when we have a prevention mindset and we're in the middle of the sea, then our primary goal is on not sinking. So we don't care what happens. We don't care where we end up. We just don't want to sink. And so thus, we're really attuned to avoiding problems. We don't want to take any risks. We want to maintain the status quo. In other words, we don't want to rock the boat. Thus, we're ultimately focused on what is urgent, which is not sticky, and not necessarily what is important, which is actually getting to land. And so that's somebody with a prevention mindset. But somebody with a promotion mindset is not that they're unconcerned about sinking, but their primary focus is on getting to a specific destination. Thus, they're willing to anticipate problems. They're willing to take risks because they know that without risk comes no rewards. Thus, they're focused on what is important and not necessarily what is urgent. And the big difference between these two mindsets are those with the prevention mindset, they get blown about by the winds and the currents of the sea, and they end up in a destination that they didn't choose. But those that have a promotion mindset, they're willing to brave the winds and the storms of the sea in order to get to a destination of their own proactive design. So let me give you, are you a soccer fan?
I like playing it, and yeah, it's all right.
So let me just give you, this is a really interesting study on these two mindsets. So at the end of a soccer game, if it's tied, then it goes to an extra 30 minutes. And if it's tied after those 30 minutes, then we enter a shootout, right?
Yeah.
I'm not the biggest soccer fan, so you can fill in any gaps for me. But they looked at these penalty shootouts, and they had found situations where if the kicker were to miss, their team would lose the game.
Yeah.
So these are situations where they're by necessity in a prevention mindset. But then they also compare that to situations where if the kicker made the penalty shot, that they would win the game. So by necessity, putting them in a promotion mindset. And here's what's fascinating about it, is that those that were in this prevention mindset, so if they missed, they would lose the game, they avoided facing the goalie, they took less time to prepare, and they converted on 62% of their shots. But the people that had a promotion mindset where if they would win the game, they spent much more time facing the goalie, they took more time to prepare, and they converted on 92% of their shots. So a 30% difference in the conversion rate just on our approach. So research on these two mindsets over and over again has compellingly found that you are going to be much more successful, engaged, satisfied in life if you have a promotion mindset. The meta-analyses that have been done have found that there's only one primary benefit to having a prevention mindset. And it's not an unimportant benefit, but it's only one, and that is you have lower safety incident rates. And one of the big questions, I did a training with an organization this last week, and they had their top 30 leaders in the organization take my mindset assessment. And then I looked at their mindsets collectively as a group. And what we found is that the mindset set where they were the worst collectively as a group was on this prevention versus promotion mindset. So they were largely prevention mindsets. And they're a customer-facing company. So they're dealing with customers all the time. And essentially their focus is what we're finding is just to not have any problems with their customers.
Right.
But that's a very different approach than trying to please their customers.
Yeah.
So because we want to avoid problems at all costs, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing anything to please or enhance the trust that their customers have with them. It just means that they just don't want any problems to occur. And they're putting out fires all over the place because they're not doing the work in advance to build the relationship with the customer such that when something bad happens, then the customer's willing to forgive them. And so operating in this prevention-minded mode is one of the things that we revealed is really limiting them as a company. It's disengaging their employees and it's disengaging to their customers.
Yeah, I think that's a whole very corporate problem as well, isn't once you get big, they say that you have to go more into like prevention style mindset of doing everything by the books and properly, and you can't be like the tech, move fast and break things, which is maybe why tech companies are like getting all the innovation and doing cool stuff these days.
Yeah, and I think that's where we talked about Ray Dalio's book, Principles. That was so great with the open and closed mindsets. Another great book on many of these mindsets is a book called Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull, who is the president. I think he's just now retiring. He's been the president of Pixar Animation. And then when Disney bought out Pixar, he became the president of Disney Animation as well. And in his book, he essentially says, if you aren't taking risk, and if you aren't even, in some instances, trying to fail, then you're not going to be creative or innovative. And so the whole book is how do we create this culture in which creativity and innovation can thrive? And it's got to be one where you're consistently seeking after winning and gains as opposed to not losing. In fact, he goes so far to say that when Disney had bought out Pixar, Disney had been primarily operating in this prevention mode, and that it was his job to change it to become more promotion minded. And so it's a really interesting case study to see the transition or the changes that he made within Disney Animation. And right after Disney Animation got took over by Pixar, then you start to see these string of hits like Tangled and Frozen. And because they have changed the culture to bring out much more innovative and creative movies than what they had in the prior 15 years.
Yeah, because I guess they'd been so successful, you can't try and do something new and different. But when the world's changing, if you keep on doing what was successful 10 years ago, it's suddenly a problem. Cool. So should we move on to the final mindset then?
Let's do it. So the last one is the difference between an inward mindset and an outward mindset. So when we have an inward mindset, we see others as objects and we value them as such. We see them as being less important than ourselves, and we see their feelings being less important than our feelings. But when we have an outward mindset, we see others as people and we value them as such. And so to me, the outward mindset is very much the servant leadership mentality. Is the people that I am leading, they're as important, if not even more important than who I am. Whereas the inward mindset is, in my visual mind, I have Captain Hook, who he's the leader and he's got Smee behind him kind of rowing his boat. Smee is my object that gets my rowboat back to my main ship. As Captain Hook, I'm not the one, I shouldn't be paddling because I'm too important to paddle. So I've got some objects to do that for me. And so that's the difference between inward and outward mindsets, how we view people.
Yeah, it sounds like quite a funny one to conceive. Are there some good studies around that?
So I would say the best material for the inward and outward mindsets comes from a small little niche consulting group called the Arbinger Institute. And so they've published several books on the topic. One is called Leadership and Self-Deception. Another one is Anatomy of Peace. A third one is called The Outward Mindsets. And it dives into these two mindsets and how it shapes really how people operate with each other. And you can think about family members as well as strangers. So one example, or some of the questions that we can ask ourselves to see whether or not we have an inward or an outward mindset in any given moment, is just recall maybe some instances where you failed to let somebody into your lane, even though they had their blinker on. Or what about the time when you failed to do something kind for a family member when it would have been easy for you to do, such as doing the dishes? Or what about the time when you gave a manager or a subordinate a fabricated excuse? I just read a statistic last week, 82% of employees can't trust their manager to tell the truth.
What?
Like, it's unreal.
Okay.
And it's because ultimately the employees that feel that way, they feel like they're treated more like a cog at work than a person. And when we're treated like cogs, it's because the people who are treating us that way, we feel like they have an inward mindset as opposed to an outward mindset. Let me give you another example that I think is a great example of this. There's a guy by the name of Benjamin Zander, who's the founder and conductor of the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra. And he's got a great TED Talk. He's also got a fantastic book called The Art of Possibility. But in both his TED Talk as well as his book, he talks about how for the first half of his career, he saw his musicians not as people, but as instruments. He saw his job as the conductor was to get them to play the music the way that he thought it should be played. And he was having this inward mindset because he saw them as instruments. But then he had an epiphany and he says, while he may be the face of the CD, he doesn't play a note. And that led him to change his mindset from being inward to being outward. So rather than seeing his musicians as instruments, he saw them as people. And in doing so, he stopped trying to get them to play the music the way that he thought it should be played. He started to get them to play the music in the way that they were most capable of performing it. So in other words, he was now trying to bring out their very best. And that's just a completely different approach to working with people. And we're going to get so much more out of them if we're seeing them as people and as valuable partners, as opposed to having an inward mindset where they're just an object there to do our bidding. And so I think that this is a really powerful, in fact, when I go into organizations and I study in all four of these sets of mindsets, the one set that the followers are most sensitive to is this difference between an inward or an outward mindset, the degree to which they feel like they're treated as a cog versus a person.
Wow. Cool. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that comes up a lot in like management books. But it is quite hard when you are a bunch of employees and you're trying to do the hard thing, learn how to do it, and then employ someone that can do this thing for you that you've automated and come up with new things as a boss. Yeah, it's interesting. Rather than empowering them to work out how to do the things they want to do, work out how to do things.
Really, when you have this inward mindset, again, these negative mindsets are attached to fears that we have. So the fears that are attached to this inward mindset is we have a fear of losing out to somebody else, or of not losing out on opportunities, not being promoted, for example. And so we try to, again, we self-protect as opposed to organization advance. And so we want to feel valued. And if we have insecurities about that, then we're likely to gain value by putting others down. And that's when we're in that space, we have that inward mindset.
So yeah, I was thought it might be that, let's say you're someone's manager and you just see them as a cog and like incapable of doing better work. And so you don't empower them because you just don't think they'd be able to do the harder, more like difficult things. But it's also, I guess you just explained, related to the fact that you almost don't want them to do good work, so it could threaten you.
Let me give you another, I would say, really powerful example. In fact, this example is one that I feel has changed my life. And this basic idea comes from Brene Brown's book, Rising Strong. But you could think about, how do you see, and maybe for anybody who may listen to this, how do you see a homeless person when you pull up, you're driving along, you come up to a street corner and there's a homeless person standing there? How do you see that person? Again, our mindsets shape how we see the different situations, and we can see them in some more negative ways and some more positive ways. And I'm ashamed to admit this, but for much of my life, when I pull up on a street corner and see a homeless person, my immediate thought, my mindsets were tuned into thinking, what are they doing? Why are they just wasting their time standing here when they could walk around and go try to find a job? And so that's when my mind is cued into that, I'm rather critical of that person standing there. I'm rather judgmental too. But what if we were to see that person standing there on the corner as though they were doing their very best, that we're truly seeing them as a person? Then if they're doing their very best, that leads me to ask the question, what on earth has happened that has led them to believe that this is the best way to live? Now we become much more empathetic and sympathetic to their situation, and I'm much more willing to help them. Again, our mindsets shape our thinking, our learning, and our behavior. And so one of the aspects of having this outward mindset is we see other people as doing their best. So in organizations, it's common for people to maybe be underperforming. What approach does a manager take to that? Do they take the approach of they're a terrible employee because they're underperforming? Or do they take the approach that they're trying their best? So what is it about their environment that isn't allowing them to succeed at their job? Is it something about me as a manager? Is it something about maybe they don't have adequate resources to function appropriately? Maybe they have team members that have demands upon their time that's not allowing them to get to their core work functions. As a manager, if we see our employees as doing the best that we can, we're going to manage and lead them much better than if we see them as though they're not doing the best that they can.
You're going to have a much more then growth mindset attitude to, okay, how can I improve my skills as a manager and empower these people to do the right things? And
exactly.
A good example I read was like, if you're sitting in the cinema and then like 10 minutes into the movie, some guy comes and like walks over you and you're like, what the hell? Who is this idiot? Why are they so rude? Why can't they just get to the cinema on time? Jesus Christ, they've ruined my movie experience. What an asshole.
Yep.
Like, the next week you go to the cinema, but like, I know you gotta have a call, it's really important and you've got to take it. And then like the taxi gets stuck in traffic and you get to the cinema 10 minutes late and you're like, oh God, I'm such a nice person. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to walk over you. Sorry, nice person. Like,
Yep.
I'm not bad. Like, obviously all these things happened in my life and like, it was just a bad scenario. But like the other person, you can't think of the bad things that happen to them. You think, oh, it's just an asshole.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Beautiful example.
So you can just definitely just have the assumption that whatever someone's doing something bad, there's probably a good reason for it instead of there's always a bad reason for it.
Yeah.
Is the lesson. Okay, cool. So that's the general concepts of all these mindsets. So what I think, 'cause they're all a bit isolated in these different mindsets, and you've got a bit more of a unifying theory about them, which I really like and buy into. But what is, because of all of these mindsets, they have like scientific studies on each individual mindset. What are those are there any meta studies where people have done scientific analysis of something as a whole group? Or is it more just tying things together and it's actually theories at this point, which all sound sensible, but
there has been very little work to connect these. Where I have seen at least comments on multiple of these mindsets in the same article is when we get into neuropsychology. And when neuropsychologists start to look at brain functioning and why it is we do what we do, and there's different theories that are out there to explain why it is we do what we do. In some of those papers, they'll reference how these mindsets, they don't always call them mindsets, but essentially that's the case. And they'll say, oh, well, Carol Dweck found this about fixed and growth mindsets, and Goldwitzer found this about the deliberative and implemental mindsets, and the regulatory focus theory, which is this prevention versus promotion. So they'll make brief reference to these different citations, which all suggest the same thing, which is much of our operating is controlled by our non-conscious processing. And here's some areas of study that have demonstrated that. So that's really the only place that I've seen these come together. But I think it speaks to the power of mindsets in the sense of when they are being cited together, it's all about the power that they have to shape whatever it is that we do. And so that when researchers, cognitive psychologists are researching why do we operate the way that we do, they continually come back to these mindsets.
cool. So at this point, I want to get into the more questions of how to put this into practice. What do you do to coach people when you're actually doing a coaching session on mindsets? What are the questions that you ask them that get them to all close up and go awkward and things? And
yeah, I think part of the key is one of the aspects is to try to get at their fears. And you don't just ask them directly about their fears, but what you do is you talk about or ask them questions related to why it is they respond to certain situations in the way that they do. So let me give you one example that came from Ray Dalio's book Principles. Is he talks about a situation where Ray had an employee that didn't put in a purchase. So Ray Dalio's operating Bridgewater Associates. It's a hedge fund. An employee didn't put in a purchase on some stocks. And because that employee forgot to put in the purchase, the customer missed out on $300,000. Now, so I present leaders with situations like this and I say, how do you respond to this? What are you going to do? And most leaders say in this situation, I need to fire them. Like we need to send a signal within the organization that this type of behavior is not acceptable. And then I say, here's what Ray Dalio said about the situation. And what Ray Dalio said, essentially, I'm not going to fire you because if I fire you, that incentivizes everybody else to cover up their mistakes. I understand that this was a legitimate mistake. I don't want you to ever do it again. But at the same time, like, I don't want to punish you because I want other people to be open to bring forward the mistakes that they make. Because it's only if we have that type of an atmosphere, the safe environment where that can occur, that we can really excel when it comes to our customer service. And so anyways, I try to bring up situations like these that unpack generally how they think about things and help them to see that they could see these situations in a different light. And what are the pros and cons of that? So that's one of the things that I do. The other things that I do actually just revolve around small incremental things that they add in to their day to improve their mindsets. Such as in fact, I got it right here on my desk because I do it every day. Have you ever used the 5-minute journal?
yeah,
So this is just a small task, 5 minutes a day. We ask, what are you grateful for? What are 3 things that would happen today that would make today amazing? And some self-affirmations. And then at the end of the day, what were the 3 amazing things that happened today? And what can I learn from this? For me, I used to have a prevention mindset, and I never really realized it until I started using the 5-minute journal. And then it forced me to be much more promotion minded. And so over time, as I've done this, use the 5-minute journal, just a small task, 5 minutes a day, I feel like it's truly rewired my brain to become focused on making progress towards my goals, as opposed to just trying not to fail. And so small little tools or interventions like the 5-minute journal, even watching positive YouTube videos, anything, the small little interventions sustained over time changes the wiring in our brain. So depending on the mindset that the person is working on, we could come up with a plan of what are some small little interventions that you can engage in on a regular basis that'll get you to change your mindsets over time.
Yeah, I found journaling is a huge way to change your mindset and be more mindful if you just observe yourself every day, and then you read back and you start seeing the themes of you constantly like talking about the same stuff. You're like, crap, I'm being an idiot. Jesus, just bloody deal with this thing. And then I did think of a good story. Have you read the Andrew Carnegie's autobiography?
No, I haven't.
When he was given like his first sort of job. He was 19 years old or something, and he was doing wage roll for this train company, and he had to take a train to go to this other town, and he had like $2,000 or something in his pocket, the most money he's ever seen in his life. But anyway, he was on the train, and then he gets to this other town, and he hasn't got the money because it fell out his pocket, and he was like, holy crap, you're going to be fired. He'd never get like another promotion in his life. Like, everything would have been terrible. He'd have spent like the next 20 years in his life paying it back. He convinces the train manager to go back along the train, and about like 10 miles, he just sees the bag on the side untouched and picks it up and says, oh my God. And he realizes that even though he's smart, you can still make massive ups, and that could have ruined his life, and he would have never gone on to become like Andrew Carnegie and the richest guy on the planet. But because of that, he realized that actually anyone can make a huge mistake, and you shouldn't just judge someone straight away for it because of it's so easy to do something, and you should allow people. And he always was able to that because we had such a big lesson straight early in life from that. And you're like, yeah, it's a really cool example because
that is a great example. Wow. Yeah. And great lesson learned there. Easier said than done too.
Yeah. It does take something big of that to actually realize it yourself and then be able to do that. But I'm reading his book. It's like a real life version of how to win friends and influence people. He just learns all these lessons himself quite luckily when he was young and was mindful to actually observe them. And just wrote that book to himself in his head just by watching what was going on in life. And
yeah, interesting. That's great. I'll have to check that out.
Right. That is the end of the interview for today. And hopefully the ending didn't come across too harsh. We possibly recorded for 1 hour and 40 minutes, which was definitely too long, although I did really enjoy it. And I think we gave a great overview of mindsets and some of the subtle but important differences for how we can view the world and operate within it. I'm sure at least a few of the examples were relatable, and certainly one of the most important things to remind yourself of is that no one thinks they have a fixed mindset or a closed mindset. And in fact, thinking that you don't have these tendencies is usually a sign that you do have them. As always, thanks a bunch for listening to the show, and we would be nothing without you, the listener. If you have been intrigued about me mentioning these calls that I'm doing on Wednesday afternoons, they are open and free to book a slot with me to have a chat, whoever you are, wherever you are. And if you're intrigued about mindsets like we're discussing today, I can certainly dig into that with you, for example. But anything else that takes your fancy, or if you just feel like being an audience research case for me and having me ask all the questions, that is fine. Then, as always, this is a podcast, and a good rating is a super, super kind way to make me feel like I'm special. And most importantly, do remember that life is too short to spend your time simply trying to not lose at things when you could ambitiously be taking bigger shots. No one is going to make you do the things you dream of other than you. So make a plan, work on yourself, and good luck.